Uh,
All right, good to go.
Can I start? Yeah, perfect. Right. Thank you.
Please.
So, good morning or good afternoon or good evening, depending on who you are, and welcome to the fifth meeting of our seminar cycle, Being Singular. And we are halfway through, actually, for this year's program, because this is the fifth appointment, and we've been discussing a lot about Parmenidean topics, so to say. So it's only natural that we go a little bit further and we discuss Plato's take on the Parmenides, so to say, with a great expert of this dialogue and of Plato's philosophy in general, Saloni de Souza. Thank you so much for being here with us. Saloni, please correct me if I'm wrong. You are assistant professor at the Heinrich Universität in Dusseldorf,
Yep.
but you've been teaching also in other universities in Europe, and you started out as a Plato scholar and as an expert in ancient Greek philosophy, but you also deal in other topics. You have a very beautiful website, actually. I was really enjoying reading it, and I believe that your current research is about old age. Is that
Yeah.
right? Is about
Yeah.
what it means being old, what is the value of being old, how do we define old age, how do we implement it in our social and ethical life, and so on. I just want to mention some of your publications. I don't know whether they came out, but there is one in particular with a really beautiful title, which I want to mention, namely Everything in its Right Place, Plato on Zeno's Paradox of Place, which is, I believe it's a Radiohead reference, hopefully. But by the way, it's also interesting because we've been discussing paradoxes and contradiction for the whole seminar. So it's beautiful that you two also that you also are writing on that. The title of your talk is Once and Many in Plato's Parmenides. Again, thank you for being with us. You have the floor, and after your presentation, we will have a small discussion. And I believe this is a great contribution to our seminar series. So again, thank you for having accepted our invitation.
Oh, thank you so much. So the first thing is that I'm really interested in kind of cross periods and reception. So I'm really excited about this. And apologies for not having been here before. We've got really long semesters in Germany, so I had lots of conflicting teaching commitments, but I should be attending from here on out. So also apologies if I'm sort of saying some things that have been said already. Feel free to sort of jump in and say, like, Saloni, you're boring us. We've already heard this. So we know that working out what singularity means is difficult in lots of contexts. It's particularly difficult in ancient Greek contexts because they don't have a word for singularity. So they've got a word for one, and singularity, so singular would be one, and singularity, whatever that might mean, maybe it's the one, maybe it's the one itself, maybe it's the nature of the one, maybe it's one again. And also their notion of one even is slightly different from ours. So mathematically, for example, they don't think that one is a number. You could use one in lots of different ways. So Aristotle famously says, one is said in many ways. And it's used in sort of ontology, in metaphysics, in epistemology. And at least pre-Aristotle, and this has probably been said already, there's often not a very clearly defined way of thinking about one. So people don't really say, well, the one is this, and give a really clear definition. And sometimes it seems like there's some kind of oneness going on, even where people don't use the word one. So if Thales says, well, everything's made of water, you might say, okay, well, water is doing some kind of onenessy work there. So it's tricky. And there's also different ideas about oneness in Plato, even if you set aside the ancient Greek stuff, and far too much to cover in one talk. So what I want to do here is reflect on some of the really complex ways that Plato gets us to think about different sorts of one or oneness in the Parmenides. So things about, conditions for oneness, problems with it. And I want to think particularly about not just one, like Parmenides one, but also kind of one more generally, one in other contexts. So I should say that obviously the Parmenides is famous and with good reason for being the dialogue where Plato says, well, here's this account of forms, and here's a whole load of problems with it. But it's one of the sort of themes of the dialogue is actually oneness. So it's often in contrast to the many, but we'll talk about that a bit later. And even if you leave aside the philosophical content, you can see that. So if you look at the structure of the dialogue, there's this question about we've got these two parts, and it's kind of they're really different in style. And there's a sort of question as you read it, like, is this one dialogue or is this sort of two mini dialogues that have been smushed together? You've got the choice of characters. Parmenides is obviously famous for having talked about the one, central to his metaphysics. Zeno is, again, you might think that Zeno himself, oneness is kind of important, but he's certainly cast in the dialogue as being somebody who's a defender of the idea of Parmenides, one. And there's also a character called Aristotle, who may or may not be supposed to remind you of the Aristotle. But if it is supposed to remind you of the Aristotle, again, obviously, bloke who talked about oneness. So I should say that at the kind of first part of the dialogue, things are kind of relatively straightforward. So we start off with, oh, hang on a second. Okay, this slide is not working. So after a sort of preamble where we get sort of the dialogue's told at three removes, with lots of sort of references to horses and stuff like that reminds you of Parmenides. We get Zeno's been reading from his book, Zeno's been reading, we've been hearing Zeno's book, and Socrates pipes up. He's presented as being young here, and he says, Socrates, hang on, let me just move this so we can see it. What do you mean by this? If things are many, they must then be both like and unlike, but that's impossible because unlike things can't be like or like things unlike. That's what you say, isn't it? Zeno agrees. If it's impossible for unlike things to be like and like things unlike, isn't it also impossible for them to be many? Because if they were many, they would have incompatible properties. Isn't this the point of your arguments, simply to maintain, in opposition to everything that is commonly said, that things are not many? And do you suppose that each of your arguments is proof for this position, so that you think you give as many proofs that are not many as your book has arguments? Isn't that what you're saying, or do I misunderstand you? Zeno agrees. So here, interestingly, we've got talk of the many, but not of the one. And Socrates is basically presenting Zeno as arguing, well, if existences are many, then they're going to have contradictory properties, namely similarity and dissimilarity. So the existences can't be many. And notice that there was a really nice bit here that's paradoxical. Zeno himself seems to admit that there are such things as many, in that he talks about you give as many proofs as things that are in your book. So kind of implicitly agreeing that there are such things as many. In this second piece, we get Socrates basically says, well, in effect, you're giving the same argument as Parmenides. So Parmenides has said the all is one, everything's one, and this seems like something that you guys have been discussing. And Zeno says, well, you're just showing that he's argued that everything is one, And Zeno is saying, well, it's not many, and I'll give you lots of arguments for that. So one of you says it's one, the other one says it's not many, and you're basically giving the same kind of argument. And Zeno says, okay, sure, but that's not quite right. So it's not that, I'm pulling the wool over somebody's eyes. It's true that I'm trying to defend Parmenides. But what I'm trying to do is say, well, look, I'm kind of trying to pay back these people, pay back in good measure for people who say, well, Parmenides' argument is ridiculous. So I'm saying, well, look, if you're right, if your hypothesis is right, it leads to even more kind of ridiculous things. So it's a kind of reductio ad absurdum is what he's offering in effect. So we've got the Parmenides here, both the fictional and the historical, is somebody who's saying, the all is one. So in other words, everything is identical to the one, everything is one and only one, and there is only one one. The opponents are saying, that's stupid, this is ridiculous, the all is many. And Zeno is saying, well, if the all is many, contradiction. So not only is Parmenides right, but the views of the opponents of Parmenides are ridiculous. Now, Plato obviously expects his reader to know about Parmenides. So to know that the historical Parmenides is going to say that the one is what is, it's eternal, it has no beginning or end, it exists all at the same time, it's continuous, it's ungenerated, it's imperishable, it's indivisible, it's whole, it's unmoving, it's spherical, limited, no change, unthinkable, speakable, believable, and knowable, arguably. So I want to suggest that even at this point, you get some suggestions that kind of all is not well with this argument. So what's being assumed in this argument by Zeno and Parmenides, but particularly by Zeno, is that something's either got to be one or many and not both. And that's how the argument works. So Zeno says, oh, well, if everything's many, it leads to ridiculousness. So it must be that everything's one. So he kind of rules out the possibility that there are things that are both one and many. And I think that there are lots of hints that actually there are lots of things that are one and many. So with the allusions to Parmenides, we've got different kinds of beings. So one and many beings, gods, demigods, humans. We get mention of horses, so that might be something, and humans, so something like natural kinds. Also get fire and water. And something that I think is really cool is the stuff about arguments themselves. So we've got, and do you suppose that each of your arguments is proof for this position, so that you give as many proofs as the things that are not as many as your book has arguments? So your arguments are many, but they're one in that they're for a particular position. Your arguments are many, your proofs are many, but they're one in that they're of one treatise or of one book. There are lots of different methods of kind of proving the same point. There's poetry versus treatises. There's proofs, which is what Parmenides is doing. He says, oh, the all is one, I'll give you some arguments for it, versus hypothesis, which is what Zeno's doing. So he says, if the many exist, then here's all this mad stuff that happens. We've also got people who are presented as being many, but sort of on one team. So those who assert the many, Socrates talks about the rest of us, and people who are certain groups of people. So individual people who are both friends and lovers. So Zeno and Parmenides, there's this detail about how they were maybe lovers once in their youth. I also think Plato is really careful to talk about details that imply that there are things that are true of Parmenides himself that imply that what is one must be able to change, which is in tension with his whole deal. So he talks about how Parmenides is very grey-haired. So he's undergone some kind of physiological change to get old. He talks about movement. So he talks about how Zeno's book's been brought to Athens for the first time. Zeno and Parmenides have once come, so they've journeyed somewhere. He talks about change that has happened. So, for example, Zeno and Parmenides might have been lovers in the past when Zeno was a boy. And there's sort of change that will happen. So Aristotle is going to become one of the 30 tyrants. But I think it's particularly interesting the way Parmenides himself is presented as, all these things are happening to Parmenides that couldn't happen if the all is one. We've then all got this stuff about the one has to be continuous and indivisible, but we get repeated references to parts of various kinds. So at the very beginning, we get reference to somebody taking somebody by the hand, which is a part of a body. And we get parts of the city, so we get reference to the porter's quarter, another place, Melite, and the city wall, which is a different kind of part, a kind of boundary. And we get spatial differentiation. So we have being outside, coming in, which again looks like something that shouldn't really be allowed to happen if Parmenides is right, that the all is one. So we get these kind of really subtle hints that something might be up, but it's not a kind of an argument. And then we get some really interesting stuff, which is that we move on. We don't actually get any argument against Parmenides at all. We move straight on to Socrates' view. And Socrates famously talks about, well, he says, well, sure, it would be problematic if, the like itself or the things themselves became, had both things at the same time. But it's fine if, some things are one and many. So he basically takes the option that Zeno has ruled out. Like, sure, some things can be one and many, some things can have contrary properties, no problem. I can be one man and have many parts. Some things could be both similar and dissimilar. The problem is that we have these things, forms, and they can't be one and many. They have to just be one. So it's kind of like Parmenides in that sense. So he says, explicitly, what a form has to be one and not many. What is not a form can be one and many. Then he has this idea about how these things are related. So if a sensible is some f, it's f in virtue of participating in the corresponding form. So properties are explained by their relations to forms. And what are not forms can be perceived of, spoken about, known, etc. What are not forms are one and many, they can be impure. And there's this slightly weird bit about where Parmenides says, oh, well, could forms include things like hair and mud and dirt and clay? And Socrates is like, no, I'm not happy about that. So it looks like things that aren't forms could include that. And the same with fire and water. He seems to be like unsure about where they go. So forms have to be just one. They're somehow pure in some way. It looks like implicitly they've got to be eternal, they're not spatially located, they've got to be kind of eternal rather than timeless, but those things don't explicitly get asserted. So, I mean, I won't go into too much detail about the nature of the forms, partly because it's tricky and partly because everybody kind of knows enough detail about them, I think, for my sort of points. So this provides an interesting contrast with Parmenides. So we've got lots of ones that are only one, not just everything. We've also got some ones that are both one and many. And that means you're not going to have the same kinds of problems. It doesn't matter if you have lots of different arguments. It doesn't matter if things change. It doesn't matter if things age, as long as it's happening at the level of the sensibles. What we don't want is for that to be happening at the level of the only ones. Now, the plural arguments one is interesting because exactly what we get is plural arguments. So that's kind of interesting, but we don't get different kind of methodologies in terms of arguments. It's all very much in the same vein. Now, of course, there's lots of arguments famously against the forms, but some of the stuff that's interesting is that it turns out to be a whole of parts. So when they're trying to explain the participation relation, Parmenides seems to show that the form is a whole of parts. Turns out that it's infinitely many because you need to keep, by the third man argument, you need to keep positing another form. So you have like a form of beauty. Well, what makes the form of beauty and all the beautiful things? What do they all have in common? Well, there must be some other form of beauty that explains them all. So you end up with them being infinitely many. And then they don't explain anything. And Parmenides also gives a quite sophisticated argument to show that you can't think about them and you kind of can't know them. So it turns out after that, well, if we've got no explanation of things being one and many, then those are going to end up being problematic as well. So I mentioned briefly already that Socrates is kind of unsure about things like water and fire and human, so natural kinds. So I think one of the things that Plato himself is getting you to think about is what kinds of one or one and many would a natural kind be? Also things like dirt, clay, hair, but they look like maybe material stuffs. What kind of ones would they be? Would they be like sensibles? Well, maybe not. Would they be like forms? Well, not really, because they're physical, but they also look kind of different from the standard case that you might imagine of like a human being, because they're all kind of one stuff. We also get a reference, really interestingly, which people don't talk about very much, to some of the people who are supposed to be at this conversation are from Klasdomeno, which is Anaxagoras's birthplace. And they're like weirdly quiet. They don't say anything. But I think one of the things that we must be wondering about would be like, well, what would people be thinking who are like fans of mixture say? Like, where would mixture be here? Presumably it would be a one and many, but how would that relate? What would happen? I mean, do they fit in this metaphysics? And if they don't, what can we do with them? So I want to turn now to the first deduction, to the second part of the Parmenides. Something quickly about this is that the second part, like, no one really knows what the hell is going on. But in the introduction to it, Parmenides basically says, well, Socrates, the reason this has all gone horribly wrong for you is that you haven't been properly trained. If you want to save the forms and save dialectic, you're going to need to do this training. And after some kind of back and forth and lots of reluctance, Parmenides gets persuaded to do the demonstration. Now, one of the things that I think we're supposed to do when we read the second deduction is kind of just think about stuff. So run it over and over again and think about things ourselves. So I'm not going to be here particularly thinking, oh, this is what the one is. I'm just going to be reading it in ways that you could read it. So in the first deduction, the hypothesis is if the one is, where the focus is on one. So you could also read it as if the one is one. And some of the principles are that the one is only one, just like Parmenides one, and the form. If anything is a whole or has parts, it's many. So what's only one mustn't have a whole and mustn't be a whole or have parts. And this is interesting. So the thought is that properties are parts, basically. So if something has a property, it kind of pluralizes the thing that has the properties. And in effect, it ends up showing that the one is kind of contradictory, because if it is, it's neither F nor not F. And it follows from that it isn't at all, and it can't be spoken of, there is no belief of it, and so on. Now, it's often thought, okay, well, this one is problematic because it's contradictory. But it's also interesting that some of the things that get denied of it are specific to Parmenides one. So, for example, one of the things that gets said is, excuse me, that things like it has no shape. Now, that's not contradictory. Something could be unextended and have no shape, but it's problematic for Parmenides, who says that the one is spherical. Or it says the one does not partake of being. Well, that's really problematic for Parmenides, because he wants to say that the one is being. So, or at least saying the one is not one, that's going to be problematic for Parmenides. The one isn't named or spoken of, or not the object of account or opinion, definitely problematic for Parmenides. The one has no limit, problematic. The one is nowhere, problematic, arguably. So I think there are properties that are denied of the one that are specifically problematic for Parmenides. And then there are also some that are problematic for forms. So it's not at rest. It's not one. He specifically says it's got to be one. It's not named or spoken of. It is named and spoken of. But the other thing that's interesting is that it also seems to apply to anything that's only one, because for anything, if it's a whole or has parts, it's many. And if properties are parts, then the one that is only one is going to have contradiction. And interestingly, that seems to be because it's kind of incompatible with the conditions for anything that's existent at all. So, for example, the things that are denied of it are things like identity. And the problem is like, well, everything that exists has to be identical to itself and non-identical to everything else. So I think that's kind of cool, is that it's just can't have any conditions, like it can't have the properties it needs to have just to be at all. Now, with the second deduction, we get something similar. So the idea is if it's one, then it must be. So here we have the same kind of thing, but here we have if the one is, it's both F and not F. So again, that's going to be problematic for the Parmenidean one. And there are further problems specific for the Parmenidean one. So for example, it has a beginning, a middle, and an end. He wants to say that it's equidistant from the center. So it's not clear that he would want to say that it has a beginning, at least. So he wants to say that we've got here that the one touches the others. He wants to say that there are no others. The one is a whole. He wants to say that the one has no parts. There are also problems for the forms again. So for example, the one turns out to be infinitely many. Definitely not what he's going to want. Again, the one is a whole, the one has parts. But again, interestingly, we get the fact that it's going to be problematic for anything that's only one because it's incompatible with the conditions for anything at all. So it's both identical to itself and everything else and non-identical to itself and everything else. And that's going to have a knock-on effect for sensibles. So if the one is and it must be, then it must be could also apply to things that are one and many, but the whole thing still explodes again. So we've got the same question. Is anyone that's only one possible? And is anyone that's both one and many possible? It's the kind of worry that we've got here. Now there's this kind of strange argument that I maybe have a bit of time to think about, that I wanted to think about. So it's a very odd argument. So basically, the idea is there's two bits to it. The first bit is basically that being has to be predicated of anything that exists. And if something's predicated of something, then it's one of its parts. But anything, whether it's anything at all, has to exist, so it has to have a being part, and any being part has to be one. Any part has to be one. And so effectively, the one has to be a whole and it has to have parts because it has to have a being part and a one part. But then we end up getting every being part has to have a one and a being part, which has to have a one and a being part, and so on. So you end up with one that's infinitely many. And again, that's going to be problematic for a one that's one and many, because you don't want something like me, I'm one person, but many parts. We don't want me to be one and infinitely many parts. And it's obviously going to be problematic for a one that's only one. So some of the things that I thought were interesting about this is, if you look back to Parmenides is not going to say that being is non-identical to the one. He's going to say that being is identical to the one. So that's kind of not going to get you off the ground. So there's a question about the relationship between being and one. Or again, you might say, well, maybe being and one are coextensive, which is kind of the move that Aristotle makes. Maybe being is a funny kind of part. So maybe it's a funny kind of property because maybe it's just not a part. I think there's another really interesting thing, which is, remember that if something's one and many, it can be one and finitely many. It just can't be one and infinitely many. So when we think back to Zeno, we might think, well, this isn't that we're talking about something that's one and infinitely divided. We're talking about something that's one and infinitely dividing. So it's really interesting the way that it gets put is something like, well, another being part appears again. If you think about the example of hair, you might think there's a difference between something that's infinitely many and indefinitely many. Or infinitely definitely many versus infinitely indefinitely many. So something like clay and mixture, those might be things that a clay might be something that's infinitely indefinitely many because you could shape it into lots of different things, but it doesn't seem to be problematic. So I think, again, it's really interesting the way you can look back and forward and see the way that you could tackle and defend various kinds of one. The final thing is that if you remember, I talked about Anaxagoras and having mixtures. So there are different ways you could conceive of a mixture. So let's say my gin and tonic. Here are 3 ways you could conceive of a mixture. If you thought of mixtures here in the third and the second and the third way, and you thought of being as those kinds of mixture. So being and one are parts, but they're not parts that you can kind of chop up. Or being and one are parts, but in a sort of all the way across. They're not discrete. So maybe mixture gives you a way out. So I hope that what I've shown is that the way that you kind of read the Parmenides gives you a really interesting insight into not just Parmenidean ones, but then, which is only one, but then alternative to Parmenidean one, which is forms, and then an alternative to another kind of one and many, and then sort of just generally anything that's only one and anything that's only many. And then the ways that we can maybe reflect on this by thinking about some of these problem cases like kinds and mixtures. So it's just really to give you a kind of oversight into the really complicated ways that Plato gets you to think about one and many. And some of the questions that I had in my mind were sort of in what sense these ones might be considered singularities or singular. So something that I was thinking about was, you might think it's kind of obvious that the Parmenides case, something that's only one, is a singular thing or a singularity. But you might think it's less obvious that something that's one and many, so say any individual or even any sum of parts where it maybe isn't an individual, counts as a something that's singular or a singularity. Another thing is that obviously we know that the Parmenides had a lot of influence on later work, and I'm sure that people here know a lot more about it than I do. So specifically in the context of like oneness, what that might tell us. And just generally what you could learn about singularity more generally by thinking about this, particularly if what I'm sort of claiming about it's just sort of supposed to get you to think about things is right. So for example, could we use some of those arguments on other concepts of singularity and say, okay, well, is it true that contradiction is going to happen if you think about any of these ones that are only one? Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you, Saloni. This was great, and it was really necessary for the economy of our seminar. So thank you for having provided such a brilliant introduction and description of some of the paradoxes included in the Parmenides. It resonates with many of the things we've been discussing. Maybe something you should know, which is maybe useful for the upcoming discussion, is that the general vibe inside of this seminar series is not very much against contradiction, so to say. There is some sort of, there is a tendency to accept contradiction into the core of the arguments relating to Parmenides and to Parmenidean philosophy more in general. But I'm sure that Greg will be more than happy to to provide to illustrate it with his intervention. So for now, what I really liked about your talk, among the other things, is that I really love when the frame, so the narrative frame of the dialogue is put in connection with the topic, which I believe is really necessary. Is really an important way of showing how brilliantly these dialogues were crafted. So thank you. That was very beautiful. I've never thought about the Parmenides in particular. So this was really, really great. And I believe also these questions are great questions in order to start the discussion, because that's precisely the point, I believe. So what is the relationship between oneness and singularity this is really maybe the main point we've been discussing and we are going to discuss later on. So again, thank you. And I believe so what I must do now is to open a discussion. So Gregory, Francesco, please feel free to come in. And if anyone on YouTube, also George, sorry, I see you're also online on Zoom. And if we have any questions on YouTube, I believe maybe Greg is able to read them for you, Saloni. So again, please, the floor is open. Anyone who wants to weigh in is now welcome to. Yeah, go ahead, Greg.
Yeah, thank you so much, Saloni, for the very nice talk. Very, very fascinating and interesting. It's 8 a.m. for me here, and so you really woke me up. I had my tea, but it took a talk on Parmenides to really to really wake me up. So thanks so much. There's so much I want to talk to you about here, but maybe I just begin with maybe one big question. Maybe connecting with what Alex was mentioning before. Yeah, just a comment. Yeah, I also appreciated the thematizing of the narrative setting. I think sometimes we overlook that in our eagerness to just get to the arguments. It's also interesting to see the implicit arguments that aren't actually fully developed, but are just kind of lying in wait there. Some of the examples I had overlooked, so this is also helpful for when I teach the class again in the future, when I teach the dialogue in the future. I have a question about the contradiction that arise in the hypotheses, and you mentioned the first and second ones. And then I also want to connect it with the reception, one of the questions that you put here. So I was recently reading I think Proclus's commentary on the Parmenides for a paper I was writing on the apophatic and cataphatic theology. And Proclus makes the argument, which is interesting, that the first hypothesis, if I remember correctly, he says that it's not really contradictory, he says, but it's something more like a violation of excluded middle, like neither F nor not F, which may also imply a contradiction if you view the relationship principles that way. So I think he's somehow invested in the contradiction, that there's a violation of excluded middle, but maybe not P and C, because there's really nothing to be said. So there's no terms that could contradict because none of them apply or something. But it does seem right that when we talk about it, then we get that contradiction, because it can't be, right? So then you have this Neoplatonic kind of disposition, which you see in like Pseudo-Dionysus, to say the way you apprehend that one, the one that's only one of the first hypothesis, is silence. Silence is the way to knowledge of the one, because nothing can be said in the neither nor structure. So I'm just curious whether you kind of your attitude towards this kind of interpretive attitude towards the Parmenides that you see taken up by the Neoplatonists like Proclus and then Pseudo-Dionysus later, where the Plato's Parmenides could be employed as a kind of tool to teach us that the one, the singular one or whatever, the one that's only one, can only be known by transcending discursivity and language. And this is maybe in connection with the way contradiction operates in the deduction. So like one strategy might be to try to take the contradiction as a problem, which of course it is in this context of Plato's thought, and then try to resolve it or find a way. And you were suggesting some strategies that were interesting to try to overcome it. But I wonder if there's like another strategy, and I'm curious about your attitude towards this, where you simply if the one is what follows, if the one is not what follows, you always get contradictions, one or the other. And then you say, oh, okay, the truth about the one is that whenever we talk about it, we get into contradiction. So then we see that the one is something that cannot be said, or the one is something that is ineffable. So what do you think of that strategy, where you don't try to necessarily resolve the contradiction in thought, but you leave it, and then you use that as a way of, as a kind of ladder to transcend language? What do you think of this kind of interpretive strategy? Yeah, so thanks so much.
So I think it's a really interesting strategy. I think so. Two things. One is that it's interesting that the knowledge and belief, etc., does come in. So it's not just that he says, all the metaphysics stuff, but the epistemic stuff does come in as well. I suppose one of the things I've always wondered about with that kind of attitude is what's to stop you in general from saying, okay, well, this is contradictory, therefore it's a thing, it's fine, but we can't get there, it's ineffable. So what is it that then makes the one so special that, it's fine to do this, but it isn't in other cases of contradiction?
Right.
Because and I do think that I would say it's an interpretive principle that you are entitled to kind of do whatever you want with part two. But I think that would be my worry about that kind of move in general.
Yeah, so like what makes it special in this case that we are allowed to leave it, and then in other cases we need it resolved. Yeah, so that would be the challenge to that reading.
Yeah.
And this also is something that I always want to raise. Again, I can't talk to Proclus, but I also want to raise to them, because they say, well, yeah, the principle holds, the PNC holds for anything we can speak about, for all assertions. But for what is beyond assertions, and he says that's the one, or the first principle, it doesn't apply, because it only governs assertions. So Proclus wants it to be, it seems, that the principle of the PNC would govern all assertions, and there's no violations of the principle when you're beyond assertions. So everything's actually consistent for him. But then I wonder how these Neoplatonists take the hypotheses as a guide for their metaphysics, when in fact the other hypotheses beyond the first one are also equally, they result in contradiction. So I would pose that question back to them myself, actually. So I think that's a very nice response. Yeah, I have more questions, but I can also wait to raise them after.
Maybe if I can weigh in really quickly on this, because there was a question actually I had, which is very closely related to this problem. You remarked at the beginning of your talk, of course, that in the Greek language there is no word for singular, so to say. There is no, of course you said, yeah, maybe the closest thing is one, so to say. But I must say that what I usually translate as singular is ekaston. So ta ekasta.
Okay.
And I believe, no, but I actually believe that this is a great, it really shows a difference in interpretation, because I believe that when you interpret the Parmenides, you have two paths, so to say. The first one is to think that we're going to speak about something special, something very peculiar, which is the one, and that the issues we have are only issues when we speak about this very peculiar thing that is ineffable, and that somehow seems to elude all the rules of language and of logic. But the other path is to take seriously what you also mentioned, namely Aristotle's idea that being and one are coextensive, namely that everything is one, and which implies that everything is contradictory. I mean that if we try and think anything as being one, we inevitably end up falling into these kinds of contradictions, so to say. And So maybe that's something. I mean, maybe it is also interesting to also in order to determine what singularity actually is, because
Mhm.
I believe this is a very core methodological decision, namely whether we think that singularity is like one element, one single peculiar thing, or whether we think of singularity as a way of describing whatever, so to say. So I believe that maybe I don't know the English translation of Eckerson, but I believe maybe a good translation will be whatever. So
Hmm.
like anything, so to
Any,
say.
yeah. I
Possibly
think so. I guess there's two complicating things. One is what would count as singular. So is it just anything you could count? Is it anything that's only one? Is it that it has to have a particular kind of structure?
Mhm.
Um, then the second problem is when you're looking at part two of the Parmenides itself, an interpretive question, which is that is the one there supposed to be something special? Or is it supposed to be any, you can take any one and run with it? I mean, so it's tricky because it doesn't look like it's clearly not supposed to be a form, but what the hell it is, I mean, it's never very clear. Sometimes it looks like it's something that has a nature. It's something that you might think to be a form. I suspect my view is you can, again, you can run it different ways and see what happens, basically. But I'd say there's two kind of complications.
And yeah, and no, thank you. If I may, maybe this is also somehow related to the what is called the greatest difficulty in the
Mhm.
Parmenides. So when they, so the problem of the separation between forms and sensible beings, so to say, because
Mm.
in a way, there is in Turin a professor of ancient philosophy, Federico Petrucci. I don't know whether he edited a new edition of the Timaeus, and he has this idea that the Stoic theory of categories is a way of answering to the greatest difficulty, or to the, so to say, to the paradoxes of the Parmenides. So that if you look at Chrysippus, and if you look at some sources we have about Stoic theory of categories, the reason they developed them is to answer the paradoxes of the Parmenides, so to say. And I believe one of the problems is precisely one interesting thing, since we're also talking about reception, and Greg mentioned so in Neoplatonism, maybe what the Stoics are also the reason why also the Stoics are interesting is because is that maybe, so basically Stoic logic and Stoic metaphysics is a metaphysic of individuals, is a metaphysic of, so to say, singular beings in a completely different ways than a Parmenidean philosophy, so to say. So I wonder whether this option you also commented is also precisely the problem of the greatest difficulty, namely,
Mm.
okay, are we going to say that there is some kind of special singularity? There is a true singular, there is some sort of extra sensible singular, or is it just a problem that is embedded in the way we talk about things? And
Mm.
maybe this is also how the greatest difficulty works. So you said that the one is not supposed to be a form, and how I read it is, so I read the Gymnasia in general is precisely a sort of so maybe I'm overdoing it, but in a formula is, you think that you are going to solve your problems by positing some kind of special beings somewhere, but this has to
Mhm.
do with how you talk about things, and whatever you say, you will still keep having these problems. You will
Mm.
keep having these issues, so to say.
Oh, that's interesting. Yeah. Yeah, I like the idea that it connects with the greatest difficulty. That's quite cool. Um, and I think your interpretation of the of part two is interesting as well. So it's the idea that there's a problem with the way that they're approaching forms in the first place?
I'd say because I mean, I really resonate with what you said. So the one is not supposed to be a form. So I believe
Right.
that maybe a way of reading it is, so to say, you are not going to escape the problem by providing some sort of ontic solution to what is an ontological problem. Namely, you are not going, I mean, you cannot posit some kind of special being that eludes or evades the issue, because the issues has to do with, is transcendental in a way. So it has to do with how you talk about whatever, about anything. So you can keep positing special beings and special things, but you will still end up having these problems. And you don't need to, you don't really need to speak about, I don't know, sensible beings being you know, the epamphoteirizing, so the basculating between being and nothing, or you don't have to speak about forms being eternal. It has to do with anything, so to say. So it is a logical question. That means that it comes before the difference between form and sensible being, in a way.
Yeah, no, that's cool. I like that. Yeah.
Because this is also an ongoing discussion between, in order to provide some answer to the first question. The problem is really, I'm a Hegel scholar, just like Gregory, and one issue is how to interpret singularity, whether singularity is only the absolute, so the one, Hegel will say, or whether singularity is, so to say, a transcendental category that applies to
Yeah.
anything. And
Yeah.
maybe that's a very important question, in my opinion. So
Yeah. I mean, I think here it's just an open question. I'm not sure that, I mean, so lots of people have, well, not lots of people, some people have views that, so for example, Verity Hart has the view that there are things like, there's a view that here we have a whole as the sum of its parts. And then you get a gesture towards the idea that actually a whole is not just the sum of its parts. And then that gets picked up in later dialogues like the Theaetetus and the Philebus and stuff. And that might give you the view that, you know, a one can't be anything at all. For example, a one has to be a unified individual. You can't just have a sum of its, like a random collection of things is not a one. So that might give you that kind of view, for example. But here I don't think there is any particular commitment in one direction or the other.
yeah, thank you. Greg, I believe you had other, yeah, please go on.
Yeah, such a fascinating conversation. Yeah, so I was just thinking about also in response, just riffing off this conversation, that and also in thinking about the question that we would pose to the person who would read the one as ineffable and would just leave contradiction. Something that Alex said, that, well, yeah, I mean, maybe part of the challenge of Parmenides and why it's so befuddling, right, is that whether the one's beyond being, there's a contradiction to say that, of course, because then it has the being of beyond being. Or if the one has being, second hypothesis already, the one with being, we get the contradiction, right? We get many contradictions there. So whether it's beyond being or it has being, you get absurdities, right? So whether it's F or not F, no matter what, you get the inconsistency. So then it looks like it seems like a logical problem here that whether it's sensible or not isn't even, it seems, the most pertinent bit, at least with the second hypothesis. It seems the big problem seems to be that you can't talk about anything without getting into trouble. That's what I wonder about with this part of the challenge of Parmenides, is that, whether the one is beyond being or the one has being, you're going to get contradictions any talking about the one at all. And it seems like you need to talk that sensible beings actually can't exist without some unity. That also seems right. Right. So it also seems a problem that if you want to talk about what sensible particulars need in order to be, you're going to get yourself into contradictions. So that's also what I wonder is whether part of the challenge of Parmenides is posing to us not just a question about how can we know and speak about the one? Is there the one? But also, how can we speak or know about anything at all?
Yeah.
Like anything whatsoever. And if we think about this as if we think about the one as a concept that is as close as we can get to singular in our sense of the seminar, then this is kind of we might think of the singular as a kind of all-pervasive something all-pervasive, and that therefore also maybe that problematizes knowledge of anything. And I've been putting this question in terms of knowledge, but we might also put it in terms of the being of anything. Like how could anything even be? Whenever we try to, articulate it, we get into these. And that's what I kind of love about the quote that you put at the beginning about one of my favorite quotes in philosophy, where Socrates says, Zeno, look, my hand is like this hand and unlike this hand, but that's not very interesting. What if the like were unlike? And then Parmenides beautifully goes to show young Socrates something, that the one is and is not, right?
Yeah.
The one itself, qua one, is both known and unknown, being and not being, in time and not in time, et cetera, in itself and not in itself, et cetera. So it's almost as though the wonder just hasn't been extinguished, and we're left with a kind of even more all-pervasive wonder at the end, maybe part of the befuddling nature of it all. So I don't want to say that that's the only thing that's going on here or something, but anyway, just some thoughts. I wanted to, maybe there's a question in there somewhere.
Yeah, I mean, it kind of is problematic either way. So either you think, I mean, arguably, so either you think that anything at all is a singularity, in which case, you're screwed, or you think that there's this special thing that's a singularity, but it's somehow prior to everything else, in which case you're screwed. So
yes, you're screwed out of
way. Kind of way. Yeah.
Yes. Yeah, exactly. That's I think you summarized my question very well. I feel like that's what Parmenides is. That's the challenge Parmenides that I feel coming from.
Yeah.
That I'm tied up in knots. There's no direction, right? That's the aporia, is that no direction. I can't move at all.
Yeah.
I'm rendered immobile in thought, so
that's
the experience of this dialogue. Yeah, exactly.
Well, it looks that we are left with lots of questions, which is very good because we're still at halfway through our seminar. I don't know whether Francesco has a question. Did you open your mic because you want to say something, Francesco?
Yeah.
Yeah, please go on.
Yeah. So thanks, Saloni, for your contribution, your presentation, so clear, so interesting. But I have to say that I am the part of the seminar that doesn't love contradiction, but loves paradoxes. Just because I studied Deleuze and other stuff against Hegelians, so I would like to say something from the side of the seminar. So I'm not an expert of Plato or ancient philosophy, but I have some curiosity. For example, the element of mathematics. First of all, from our point of view, one is a number, but you say that is not a number by the Greek, or as some elements that doesn't fix as a number. But I have to say that from my naive reading of the dialogue, I have a question. So, what kind of dialogue is? Because I'm very, for me, it's very strange to think that one hypothesis is true and the other is false. But what's the sense, not the meaning, the sense of the entire dialogue? So the point is that the Parmenides is an aporetic dialogue. It will be there is no just definitive solution to the question. So what is the question is about one. From the reading, but the reading by Deleuze and their sources, I think that the point is that the one or the number distinction, the distinction for numbers, cannot be useful to resolve that kind of problem. From another point of view, I think that we can read this kind of dialogue with the paradox of Bertrand Russell, of Kurt Gödel, of the uncompleteness. The theory on completeness. So there is no something that can be or can grasp the entireness, because there is always some element that goes beyond the ensemble. So I would like to have some reaction to this element. What's the element of mathematics? And if you think that the only one problem is the problem of the logic categories to analyze the das Ganze, the allness. So, and if the dialogue is aporetic or not. So that's my question, my problem.
Okay, so there's lots of cool questions there. So with the number thing, so they don't call it a number, so they call everything else a number, like 2, 3, 4, 5, etc. So the thought seems to be that it's some kind of unit. So maybe it's something like, you count with it, but it's not itself a number. That might be the idea. But they don't call it a number. So that was the thought, whereas we would, very happily call one a number. With regard to the tricky thing about the Parmenides is the way that, well, the second part is the way that it's presented is this is some kind of exercise. So it's not presented as though it's going to be aporetic. And usually when you get an aporia in Platonic dialogues, the whole point of it is that you get some kind of reaction. So you'll get somebody saying, oh my God, I don't know what the hell to do, I'm numb or I'm really confused. And the really weird thing with this is that you get Parmenides saying, here's basically there's a massive contradiction that he offers. And Aristotle just says, yeah, very true. And that's the end of the dialogue. So it's really difficult to understand what the hell is going on there, because you get somebody giving a wholehearted agreement to what looks like a contradiction, and then there's no return to the frame. So you don't get any reaction from Socrates, you don't get any reaction from the people who are telling the story. So it's more like, I guess, the aporia is in the reader than in the dialogue itself, which makes it really tricky. So that's the kind of tricky thing. I'm not sure I followed the stuff, the kind of interpretation you were offering, probably because I'm not familiar with it. So could you just sort of reiterate that?
Yeah, it's the problem of the it's quite complicated. I know if I will be very clear, but the point is that if there is no it cannot you can also have some limited system that are coherent. Otherwise, if you want to think about a omnicomprehensive and an element, a category that can comprehend everything, it cannot be coherence. That's the Gödel version of the paradox. But the point is, if you cannot think about the one, just because the one cannot be the all, because the one cannot oh, sorry, I'm losing my English, sorry. The one can be part of himself. there is something. There is the problem of the ensemble of the English of insieme, Alessandro. Sorry, I'm losing my English today.
Set.
Sets, the sets of all the sets.
Yeah.
Paradox. So you cannot the one you can think the one as the sets of all the sets.
Yes.
Because the one cannot be the set of itself.
Yeah.
So I think that this can be the reading of this dialogue. So I know it's a very naive reading of Plato, but he wants to say that if you think the one from a logic point of view, the one cannot be the all, because the one cannot be a set of itself.
That's really nice. I really like that. Yeah. Yeah, I have to think about it, but I really like that. I'm really tempted. I really like the idea that Plato has just preempted that paradox. That would be cool.
Okay.
In this way, for me, something very similar to Marcus Gabriel's argument against the existence of the word. Is that right? So, so fields of sense develops a very similar argument, but I wonder, isn't this an argument against the whole and not against the one? Sorry if I mean,
It's true.
aren't we conflating the two dimensions now? Because
Yes,
sorry?
Yeah. Oh, go ahead.
No, but
No, I was just wondering, maybe a possible. I mean, of course, there are very good arguments in order to do this, but maybe a difference can be identified with the fact that when we think about the whole, we precisely speak about what you said. So, namely, that there is nothing outside of it in a way. When we speak about the one, maybe what we are emphasizing is the fact that it is unrelated to anything else. So that it is, so to say, there is not, I don't know, it is alone. It's a lonely one, so to say.
It's absolute from the
Precisely. Yeah,
point of view. Yeah, but it's something like it's a true concept that are related. The problem of the all is that there is the only one all. It cannot be other all. Otherwise, you have something outside the all. In the Parmenidians dialogue, in the Parmenian dialogue, you have through the four hypotheses, you have the reaction between these two elements. I have not the ultimate solution, absolutely, but I think there are also these elements, or you can see these elements in this.
No, I was just wondering, in order to also to discuss the second question we see in the Saloni's presentation. So maybe this is also part of the reception of the Parmenides, namely the path through which we started differentiating these elements. So the singular, the one, the whole, the identical, the absolute, etc., etc. So maybe that's also another thing. So great. Are there any other? Yeah, Gregor, please go on.
I want to pick up on Francesco's question about the one being being a member of itself, because the second hypothesis basically does that. So you have one, as you said, Saloni, you have one in being, and the one is a being, and the being is one. So you have one being, but the one being is one and is a being, and the one being is one and the being. So the one is a member of itself, and so is being is a member of itself. And that is immediately what happens in second. And this is also, I think, why Hegel loved the dialogue so much, is because you have these concepts that are instances of themselves, members of themselves. And that's paradoxical as it's presented in the dialogue, of course. And it's, well, even though it's for us, maybe the reader is just left, as you said, Saloni, it's just left Aristotle, yes. Right, just nodding along. But you have this beautiful, in the second hypothesis, you have this, the once beyond being, you can't say anything, but the minute it's with being, it's a member of itself. And so I think that does, that does invite, I think, questions and connections to modern formulations of problems concerning related topics, at least, is to also accommodate Alex's point that whole and one are not exactly the same, but they're related, that it does invite those questions that arise about totalities. Since I think we are dealing with totalities in the second hypothesis anyway, I think that's pretty clear that we are dealing with totalities there, because we're dealing with many. I mean, you have one many there in the second, and there's a kind of totality question. So I think the second hypothesis is really very fascinating in this aspect of this whole that's a member of itself, and that's not necessarily paradoxical. You have these contemporary analytic treatments where you can have wholes that are their own parts that aren't necessarily paradoxical, but definitely you get that in the Parmenides and in people like Hegel and such. Yeah, so just to maybe connect that Francesco's point with that particular hypothesis. And there's other places too, like where in the third man regress, and this is one maybe I'll just pose a question to you, Saloni, about you've emphasized wholes and parts a lot in the presentation. And I'm wondering whether you think wholes and parts have that this concept pair, they're of course linked. You can't have a whole without parts and parts without whole. Whether this concept pair is of a special relevance to the Parmenides. It's like a key concept. There are a lot of other notions that generate paradoxes or that are considered in the hypotheses, right? There's a whole set of predicates that are considered in different sets of reasonings. Like in the third man regress, there's self-reference going on, like greatness is right, and then like greatness is great, and that seems to move things along a bit. I'm curious about your the presence, like the role of the whole and parts for you in this dialogue. You have special relevance.
So I think it is especially relevant in the sense that it comes up again and again, but also it's used certainly in the first and the second deductions. It's not that it seems to be like a kind of one of the driving principles, as it were. So it's established very early on, and then it kind of drives the whole argument. So rather than just being kind of another one, if you like, of a list of things that's ascribed or denied to the one, it's like seems to play a really important role in driving the whole thing. So I think it's kind of two reasons that it's really important is that unlike something like, say, shape or beginning, middle, and end, which seem to be kind of quite limited in terms of where they have their place in the dialogue, they're kind of, you can see it kind of playing a role throughout. And second of all, the kind of role they have within the deductions themselves. So I'd say kind of two reasons why they have that kind of special place.
Yeah, that's also very interesting to connect with the previous conversation we were having about, say, whole of wholes and the one. Like when we think about totalities or absolute totality, think about, or if you use the word of whole, because sets and wholes aren't the same thing either. We think about the whole of wholes and the one, that these questions would really be speaking about what can we learn about singularity more generally, or influence on later work, that this relation of thinking about the whole and oneness. Plato is really maybe teaching us here that in order to think about oneness or the whole, that somehow these belong together. We need to somehow think about them together.
Which is also, if I may, the reason why Aristotle says that being and one are not genus, because they are part of themselves. So, which is also, I mean, it is actually a discussion inside of the Platonic school, namely, how do you make sense of oneness and of being a whole? And it can be argued that they were very, very much aware of this problem. So this is really a core aspect of the discussion inside of the academia, and that Aristotle's idea of genus and species is only one solution, and a partial solution, because he has to set exceptions, for so to say. So or he has to set a very strange rule. So this rule that in order to be a genus, it must not be part of itself, which is, I mean, I don't know why. So, or you don't have to predicate it of its differences. It seems really random as a rule in order to speak about genus and species. So, but yeah, sorry, just a comment.
Yeah, it's also interesting that some of the things, the things I was saying, you know, are conditions for existence at all, get picked up as being kind of lumped in with one and being. So sameness, in Aristotle, he kind of treats together with one being and same. He kind of treats together, and that might be another thing that might be and there is quite a lot of, well, I think anyway, of reason to think that he's got some of this in mind when he's talking about identity and oneness and being.
Yeah, just this that the problem is already treated and addressed within the ancient schools is really clear. I mean, the whole discussions of pros hen, unity by analogy, all of this is clearly in response to the fact that Aristotle raises the third man in the metaphysics itself already connects with the dialogue. And I know there's different readings of that connection, but it's very clearly not something people aren't aware of. And it really makes it's all the more fascinating to be delving. But just to also respond to the question about randomness, I mean, to me, actually, Aristotle's denial of the self-inclusion makes good sense if you take as a third man regress. Like in one of the, I think it's book Ada, I think it's Ada, where he says, you'll have to double check me, Saloni. It's been a while since I book. But Aristotle says something like one way to block the third man regress, if you have form and matter, then you have a form for the form and matter, then you're going to get this participation regress problem, right? So if you say that that the form and the material are both elements of the whole, then you'll need a form of the form and matter. And then if that form is an element of the whole, you'll need a form for those three, for form, and matter. And it goes on infinitely. So I feel like Aristotle wants to block the third man regress by saying that the form isn't an element of the whole. Because once you make it an element, you make it into a material principle, and then you need a form for the form. And then you're set off on Plato's infinite regress, greatness is great business. So if you can deny the self-referential predication and the self-inclusion, you can maybe block at least one version of third man and one version of the participation problem, even though there are other formulations in the Parmenides, probably, like there will be other versions of the issue of the problem, but at least that will be one. I don't know. This is just one, just thinking about why Aristotle may be making sense. Even though I'm not inclined to accept his solution, why I think he's making sense or trying to make sense here in reference to the Parmenides. Saloni, do you have thoughts about that? I don't know, since you're the Aristotle expert here, properly speaking.
No, I think that makes sense to me. I'm just thinking that seems plausible to me. I mean, I think a lot of what Aristotle does is sort of block moves by I don't know how to describe it, but maybe blocking separating things off. So, and that's something that like form comes in particularly useful for, right? So you can't just say, oh, separate off being and now being's apart. You kind of can't do that. So I think that's a I think that's a strategy that works quite well in all sorts of ways for him. But yeah, I think he's thinking really carefully about how you get out of the problems, actually. Which makes sense if you're thinking about that it going on in the academy.
We need a whole seminar on Plato and Aristotle, obviously.
Yeah.
So we're trying to do
Good idea for the next one. Yeah.
Yes.
So this is usually our time, but of course we can go on with the discussion if there are other questions. Is there any other question?
Let me just check YouTube just to confirm.
Yeah.
You've been generally pretty quiet during our seminars, but it will be up on YouTube for a while, and then people will have the luxury of watching your talk over the next months. So.
Yeah, there were also a couple of participants in the seminar that weren't able to be present today, and they were hoping they will be able to catch up in future. So this will be good.
So all the other talks are on YouTube then, so I'll be able to watch them.
Yes.
Oh, okay, fab.
If you're interested in
yeah, no, I'd like to. Yeah,
looking at the others, so you can watch everything on YouTube. So if there aren't any other questions, I'd really like to thank again Saloni for this beautiful talk and for this great contribution to our seminar. And I believe this is really a great continuation of our work. And again, this will be thanks for the beautiful discussion as well, for your generosity in answering our questions.
Thank you. It was really, really fun. Thank you so much for having me and for asking such interesting questions and giving me such interesting thoughts. Thank you.
Thanks so much. Our pleasure.
Our pleasure. Absolutely.
Bye.
And we will see. So next meeting is on the 19th. And if you're going to be able to be with us, it will be our honor, of course. But I mean, hopefully the semester will be through. So
should be, yeah.
Sooner or later. So
yeah.
again, thanks
Bye-bye.
everyone.